It's an exciting time. You start up a new card game and you're dealt your cards. You take a look at your hand and maybe you start looking at them and rearranging them so they're easier to keep track of. All right, I'm going to put my sets of 2 over here. Or maybe this game I should actually just arrange them in ascending order. But what if I told you there are games in which when you get your cards, you're not allowed to rearrange them at all. You have to play them as is. Minasan, konnichiwa, and welcome to the Board Game Dojo's Board Game Tyson series, where we take a look at a couple of games that you might buy for a similar or the same reason or purpose, and figure out which one is more worth a spot on your shelf. Today we are looking at 2 games in which have that exact selling point. You cannot rearrange your hands once you get them. Scout and Dealt, or you might see it as Krass Kariert or Checkered Crosses. And I think we're actually the first one to do a comparison on these 2 games.
Now I'm going to look at Scout in a little more detail versus another game that was inspired by, called Dealt in North America. Dealt was rebranded in 2020. It used to be out in Europe as Krass Kariert. So they use similar mechanisms, but they're very different games. So let me show you the differences. I'm going to show you how you play both of these at a high level, and then we'll come back and we'll do sort of a versus.
So that is Krass Kariert, or Dealt. This is such a lovely game. It definitely gets the Super Shedder Award. But what we're really here for is comparing it to Scout.
Okay, maybe not. But in all fairness, and this is a bit of a spoiler, Game Boy Geek chose Dealt and Taylor's trick-taking table chose Scout. So really, the Board Game Dojo today is going to be the deciding vote. Which is the better you can't rearrange the cards in your hand strategy card game? Well, I need to come up with a better, shortened thing for the YouTube title for that later, but that's a later problem. Hajime! So like I said earlier, both of these games involve not being able to rearrange the cards in your hand after you're dealt them. So both of them involve strategies in which you will get the cards in your hand like so. So this has an 8, a 4, and a 9. And you're going to spend part of the game trying to figure out how to get rid of this 4, so now you have an 8 and a 9 together. But besides that, there's a lot of differences between these 2. Now, I'm not going to do a full teach-through on these games, but I am at least going to show you a little bit of the differences. So let's start by explaining Dealt. And I forgot to mention earlier that both of these games are actually climbing and shedding games, meaning that you will be playing cards progressively higher than the last person on the table. So if the player before us were to play a 5, and we take a look at our hand, what card is higher than a 5? I don't know, let's go with this 8 right here. Go our turn, play an 8, and it'll be the next person's turn after us. However, a thing that also happens in Dealt is, let's say that the person before us plays a pair of 12s on the table. Now, if you look at our hand, well, we're not able to beat that. So we have 2 cards that kind of work as our buffer, our shield, if you will. Even if you can play, you can choose to just pass and do this, but in this case, we can't beat that, so we need to take one of these 2 cards into our hand, and we can place it anywhere. So I think I'm going to place the 9 here, so that now I have this nice 7, 8, 9 run here. The trick will be over, and now the next play will start. It also has these kind of special power cards that can also help you out in case of that happening where you can't play anything. So this one is that the winner of the trick needs to draw 3 cards, which when you're trying to get rid of cards, that's not a very helpful thing, right? This is an X, so it can count as kind of a while with your card. So if I wanted to play it with a 2 that was in my hand, now this can count as 2 2s. And this one just stops the trick right where it is. However, here's what happens. The reason that these defenses is really important is because if you, let's set up that situation from earlier, right? If we're in this situation where we're in this 12s and, well, looking at our hand, let's say we're gonna reset this back, right? So let's say we're in this situation in which we can't beat these 12s and we don't have any cards here, we actually lose one of our 2 lives. And then we will actually reshuffle and a whole new round will start. However, if we lose both of these lives, we are out. We lose and everybody else wins. That's right. Dealt is a game that has 1 loser and everybody else wins. So if that's a turn off for you, this game is already out. But let's move on to talking about Scout. Scout is a much more free-flowing game that is all about points denoted by these Scout chips. How it works is that if the player, before you place a card, let's say, so there's that one, and this one is going to be a 2, and this is our hand here, we can beat that by playing a 5. But in this instance, we actually take the card before us, and this is now going to be worth 1 point, and we replace it with our card, which is a 5, which is higher. Instead, though, let's say that they play something like an 8 and a 9. Well, taking a look at our hand, we can't beat that. So what we would do in this instance is we would scout. We would give them one of these point chips that they get to add up at the end of the round, and we will take a card from them. So I think that we are going to take the 8 from their thing, and we are going to put it next to our 8, so now we have 2 8s. Now, I can choose at this point to use my scout and play. You only get one of these per round. It means that you can scout and then play something the same round. But I think we're going to save it for a later date because this is really crucial later on in the round usually. The round goes until either somebody runs out of cards or it goes all the way around the table with everybody scouting. And then you tally up your points. You play the number of rounds as the number of plays, and whoever has the most points at the end of the game wins. Now I'm going to clean this up and we're going to go over our evaluations. So in our board game Tyson series, we are only trying to compare the games based on reasons that you would actually make the purchase. So for example, we're not going to look at the theme of these two games because I don't think anybody is choosing one or the other based on the theme. At least I hope not. The 5 categories that we thought were the most relevant would be first, the gameplay and the feeling that you get while playing the game. 2, the strategy, because both of these games sell themselves as strategic games. 3 and 4, we're going to kind of go through just pretty briefly, and that is the amount of players you can play at, and are they good at those player counts, and the game length, are they variable or fixed, and finally the overall value, does it have a high replayability, and if you want to replay it over and over again, does it have the components to hold up over time? So let's start right away with the gameplay and the feeling, because honestly this is the biggest difference between the two games, and it might just be the only thing you need to hear to decide whether one game or the other is your pick. So first of all, let's talk about what the game feels like in terms of what camp it's really from, because they feel from 2 different eras, if you will. Delt feels much more in line with the traditional games. The game came out in 2018, but I wouldn't have been surprised if it came out in 2007 or 1957, because it has the traditional feeling of, okay, you're going to play a hand, and then once somebody can't play anymore, you need to reshuffle, redeal, things like that. Over hundreds of years, this has made certain games that have a similar aspect to it a social thing. Mahjong is prominent in so many social circles and has been important in different groups' evolution based solely on this. When you're redealing out those tiles, it gives a chance for everybody around the table to kind of catch up with each other, talk about the weather, talk about the news, whatever it might be. Delt gives that same feeling. Because you're going to be redealing quite a few times throughout this game, it gives a chance to kind of take a break from the action, if you will. Scout, on the other hand, comes more from the modern camp, the modern style of board games, where the point is to remain in the action as long as possible to keep the game flowing, because if people leave out of that game flow, then they start getting distracted and not really concentrating on what they're supposed to be concentrating on, which both of them kind of have their perks and their drawbacks. And if this was the only thing that they differed on, if this was the only kind of feeling we were going to base their ratings on, then I would say, I don't know, pick the one that sounds more like what your friends will like. Do you want the more social game, the more laid back, like, okay, you're going to be dealing out a lot more cards, or do you want the more modern take on things? But that's not, because another really important thing in these games is how do you win? And it's such a dramatic difference. Because Delt goes the way of you have one loser and everybody else wins, whereas Scout does the complete opposite and says you have one winner and then a bunch of non-winners, a bunch of losers, I guess. It makes the game feel different. They sell themselves as being strategy games. That's why we're going over strategy in the next section. But what it means is that if you become better at the game, how does that feel in the winning conditions? And in Delt, it just feels like it doesn't really matter that much. It matters that you're good at it, but it doesn't matter because it doesn't matter if you're the best at it or the second best at it. You just aren't the worst at it, and that's what's important. This idea that it doesn't matter if you're the best or the second best or the third best as long as you're not the worst feels weird for a strategic card game. It doesn't quite fit because you might be sitting there for 30, 40 minutes just trying your best to figure out how to play your hand, when in reality, as long as somebody's doing worse than you, you're fine. It's just a strange dissonance. Where in terms of Scout, it fits a little bit better because in Scout, it is all about, can you get good enough at this game to beat everyone at the table? It actually tends to match, like, okay, I'm playing a strategy game. I need to really concentrate on how to make the best strategy. Did you this game? Great, you win. Did you not? Okay, you lose. But in that instance, you feel like you deserved your win or you deserved the loss. Whereas in Dealt, you probably deserved the loss, which feels really, really bad. But the winners didn't necessarily deserve their win. In summation, Dealt is more a part of the traditional card game family, and Scout is part of the modern card game family. And if that was the only difference, then I'd just say, hey, pick whichever one you want. But because Dealt has this really weird win condition where the losses are harsh and the wins don't quite feel deserved, but Scout has both the wins and losses feeling well deserved, we're going to give the point to Scout. The second thing we want to talk about is strategy, because both these games market themselves as strategy card games. So what does that mean exactly for both of these games? So let's say you're dealt cards and you end up with this, where you get 2 7s, but they're separated out by the 6. So you really want this 6 out of there somehow, because then, oof, now you got a pair of 7s. When and how you are going to do this is going to matter in both of these games. Scout feels like an all-out race, a freestyle race, if you will, where there's a couple different ways in order to get to the end first, to get rid of these cards first. In Scout, something that'll frequently happen is that you'll look at these and go, okay, well, I need to get rid of that 6. I'm going to get rid of this 6 on this turn. And then the person in turn order before you plays a pair of 7s. And you go, you look at your cards and you go, you know what would be better than ending up with 2 7s would be if I scout that card before me. I'm giving them a point, which I don't really want to do, but then I can maybe later on in the game put that in my hand, and now when I get rid of that 6, I've got 3 7s, which is going to be a lot harder to beat, which means that I'm going to get more points from other people, and maybe it'll even get all around the table. You're going to make these kinds of decisions because ultimately your goal is to be the very best, like no one ever was. Whereas in Dealt, you're going through it with a different mindset because you're really going at this more from the perspective of you were trying to tread water for longer than everybody else. It's an endurance. It's you look at the cards in your hand at the very beginning, and then from there, try to figure out how you're going to last the longest. You take a look at those 2 cards that are your defense, your shield in front of you, and one of the most important decisions that you're going to make, one of the most interesting decisions that you're going to make throughout the game is to decide whether to keep those as defense or use those to bolster your hand in some way. So maybe instead of looking at this and saying, okay, I want to get rid of that 6 in the middle, it's I have this 8 as a reserve card, it has an 8 as a shield, and I really want to put that into the hand, so now I have a 6, 7, 8, and that's going to be hard to beat. But then you're giving up one of your shields. It more feels like Scout is all about adaptability. It's all about coming up with strategy, but being ready to get rid of that strategy on the fly. Whereas Dealt is all about how well you can plan out your moves. How well did you figure out how to best use the cards in your hand? So if you're somebody who really wants planning, if you really want strategy in your games, if you want to take a look at those cards, figure out the puzzle that is, in what order can I play these the best, then I think you're going to like Dealt. And so for strategy, we're actually going to give the point to Dealt. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is game length. And we're not going to take too long to talk about it. Hopefully, I do ramble a bit. But these 2 games really feel different in their length because in Scout, the game length is very fixed. You get to the end of the round, you tally your points, you play as many rounds as there are players. So in 2-player game, it's 2 rounds. In 3-player game, it's 3 rounds, etc. Then you tally up all your points to the final round. Whoever has the most points at the end of the game wins. Done. And you can adjust this for the amount of time that you have. So I don't think I've ever actually played a 5-round game of this, even though I've played this at 5 players before. We usually just try to do 3 or 4 rounds and we call it good. Whereas Dealt is very variable. Sometimes you'll have games that take 5 minutes because one person just lost both of their lives really, really quickly. Other times, it takes 45 minutes to play a game that honestly felt like it should have taken 30. And it's weird because Dealt can be fun while you're playing it. Dealt is fun while you're playing it, but it just never quite feels right. It either is way too short or goes on 10 minutes longer than it should. And 10 minutes long doesn't sound that bad, right? And maybe that's true if we were playing a 2-hour game, because then an extra 10 minutes isn't anything. But when the game is supposed to take 30 minutes, and it takes an extra 10 minutes, that's an extra third of a game. When I take a game off the shelf, especially a card game or even like a party game or something like it, I want to know how much time it's going to take, because I'm probably filling a certain amount of time that I have. If I bring the card off because we have a half an hour before dinner and we don't want to just play a quick game in, if we bring off Dealt, we might end 25 minutes before dinner, or we might end 20 minutes after dinner was already ready. Something like that. So in terms of game length, because I just like more of the fixed game setting, I like knowing how much I play, and then if I have 30 minutes before dinner, I can maybe shorten it if I have a 5-player game or a 4-player game to maybe 2 or 3 rounds. I just like that a lot better. Point for Scout. The next thing I want to talk about, just really briefly, is player count. Both of these games on the boxes said that they play 3 to 5, and there is a 2-player variant though for Scout. So do they play well at all of those player counts? And I would say not really. Let's start at 2-player, because 2-player is only available in Scout and not in Dealt. And according to BGG, lots of people really do not like the 2-player variant for Scout. However, we are in the minority because we actually really enjoy it at 2. It turns from more of a tactical game to a more strategic game. It feels a lot more like Dealt, where you're planning out your moves in advance, because the way that the 2-player game works is that each player gets 11 cards and 3 Scout chips. If at any point one of the 2 players needs to scout but cannot because they ran out of those chips, and so therefore they can't play anything, the round ends. The other way it would do is if somebody runs out of cards, then you tally up your points, you only play 2 rounds, game is over. It plays so quick, and it's really fun at 2, I think, but I'm in the minority for that one. So that goes to Scout. At 3, Dealt feels like where it's supposed to be. It's not overly long, it has those interesting decisions, has the strategy involved in it. 3 is kind of where, like 3 and 4 is where that's at in Dealt, whereas at 3 in Scout, it works, but there isn't as much going around for you to actually be able to adapt to. There isn't as much, I think, where in Dealt at 3 and 4, they have those power-up cards that allow you to more adapt at the lower player counts. At Scout, because scouting is so important, at 3 it just doesn't quite work because you're not getting as much choice. There's not as many people scouting in the middle. There's not as many cards in the middle that are scoutable. So at 3, it kind of doesn't quite work at Scout, but Dealt works great. At 4, both of these, 4 is probably the best player count for both of these games. Everything just shines exactly how it should, so that's pretty great. And at 5, Dealt just falls apart. It takes way too long to do anything, and you really just can't plan for anything. And Scout at 5, you have so many options going around the table. It's, I think, the most, I don't want to say chaotic, but it's most scouty-ness. So in review, 2 players, Scout. 3 players, Dealt. 4 players, even. 5 players, Scout. That means Scout gets the point for player count. So finally, we're going to talk about the value of the game. If you're going to purchase this game, are you going to want to play it over and over again? And if you're going to play it over and over again, do the components hold up? So let's start with the replayability for both. Both of these are going to be games in which you are going to want to try again and again. Both of these have their reasons for really their replayability. The variable game length that we talked about earlier that we weren't really big fans of is one of those reasons you might play Dealt again and again. If you play a game that only lasts 5 minutes, then you're going to be like, okay, let's just pick it up and try it again. That was crazy that happened. Let's try it again. Or if it's only 20 minutes, you might play another game, something like it. Whereas in Scout, the reason that you're going to want to replay over and over again is because it gives you a reason to want to get better at it, because there's only one winner. Maybe you don't win the first time or the second time or the third time or the fourth time if you're me, but you want to get there. You want to replay it again so that you can improve upon it, get better at adapting. Both these games are fun multiple times. There is a lot to do. There is a lot to get better at And as we're talking about improving, Delt also has that, because Delt has a lot of this forward planning and seeing how well you can use the cards in your hand, when to use your shield cards as a part of your hand instead of as a shield. Both games have a nice development where players do want to play it again to get better at it, and there is a nice improvement thing where you can see yourself getting better at it. Unfortunately, it's kind of sad about the winning conditions in Delt, that like even if you have gotten better at it, you don't really know if you were like the best or the second best or the third best, but it feels good to just not lose. So next, let's talk about the components. You can see that I have the Japanese version of Scout. I actually also have the Japanese version of Delt here, but both of the boxes are fine. The cards in Scout are this kind of plastic, very bendy style of card here, whereas in the Krass Kariert ones, they're a bit more traditional card games, kind of like the Amigo style if you've ever played those games. I honestly think that, yeah, the Scout version feels a lot better, but in a lot of places, Delt is half the cost as Scout, so you have to take that into consideration when you're looking at components. Yeah, for $10, this is kind of what I would expect Delt would look like. For $20, this is kind of what I would expect that to look like. So it's kind of hard to compare the two at their price points, especially when they're both pretty replayable as well. So actually, in terms of value, I think they're both an excellent value for what you're going to get. So it's a tie. So to sum up our judgment, we had 5 categories we looked at today. We looked at the gameplay feeling, what does it feel like, and we said Scout feels better. For strategy, we said Delt is much more in favor of those who enjoy a very strategic and forward planning card game. In terms of player count, Scout is better at more player counts. In terms of game length, Scout is also just better. We just prefer the more fixed time limit more than a variable. It could take 5 minutes or 45. And then at the end, we said both are great values. You're going to be replaying them over and over again, and both of them have good quality components for the price point that they're at. So that means that with the score of 3-1, Scout is our champion. Now, one thing worth mentioning is that unlike some of our other videos, we really do feel like you don't need to own both. Yes, we do, but it's probably going to be one of those where I'm going to give it to a friend who enjoyed Delt after we're done filming this. There is no reason that you need both unless you want to just try it or get it for a decent price. Sure, they give you a lot of the same feelings, just in a different way, but I don't think that you can go wrong with either one of these games. It's kind of rough when we're doing it and not giving a full review to one of these games. We really do like Delt. We think Delt is a good game. It's just compared to Scout, we feel like Scout does it better. So I hope that makes sense. So if you're listening to this review and saying, oh, I think Delt actually sounds pretty good, it is. And you can't go wrong with buying that one either. If you feel like your group is going to enjoy that one, you like the traditional feeling, you think the variable time limit sounds a lot more fun, go for it. You're going to have a great time. Well, thank you so much for watching today. Arigatou gozaimashita. Until next time, じゃあね。